All right, welcome to the 2022 draft recap for the NHL Draft for the Buffalo Sabres. Now, the Sabres were busy, and they did pretty well, in my opinion. All things considered, based on where they drafted and who they picked and who was left on the board, honestly, I think that there are many universes where the Buffalo Sabres have the best first round out of anyone in the National Hockey League this year. They got guys that I had ranked at 7, 18, and 21, at 9, 16, and 28. To me, that rocks. I mean, there might have been some nitpicky stuff here and there where I could have said, maybe I wouldn't take Jiri Kulich, but I would have taken, I don't know, maybe Gleb Trikozov, whatever. You could have had him at 41, if I guess when you look back on it. But all things being considered, and in realistic terms, I thought they did great on day one. Matthew Savoy, we can start there. Could be one of the more exciting, dynamic offensive players to come out of the draft. You know, just an awesome, high-skill offensive player. Agile. He can set up a play. He can finish a play. There's just a few things that I think need to be worked on in terms of his physical strength and his quickness to sort of create separation from players, and make himself more of a breakout target than he was. He was very much a sort of passive player outside the offensive zone when his team was playing offense. Defensively, I think he's underrated. I think his defensive game is better than you would think, and his resilience under pressure is also pretty good. But that kind of stuff will get more difficult as he gets older at higher levels. So I'll be very interested to see what happens with Savoy. I had him ranked top 10. I had a feeling he might slip, but Buffalo just kind of said screw it and took the high ceiling pick with Savoy, and I can't really fault them for it. I really like Matthew Savoy. Again, agile, quick hands, good finisher, good playmaker as well, really good below the goal line as well, sort of seeing the ice and making little seams and such. So there's a lot to like with Savoy, and I think that's a really nice high upside swing at 9. You could send him back to junior for a year or two, and he could be an NHL player relatively soon, and a pretty good offensive one too. Like the idea of him passing pucks to guys like Jack Quinn, for all that's been said about Jack Quinn over the years, he's coming along rather nicely, and the idea of Matthew Savoy setting him up is pretty tantalizing one day. Not that you want to make lines based on who you're drafting specifically, but you see what I mean. And you put JJ Peterka on that line to be the wrecking ball that does also other stuff. But Noah Ostlund at 16, also a huge fan of that pick. I thought he would go later, honestly. I've been a bit of an Ostlund skeptic in terms of his overall projectability, similar to Savoy. But if they really think they can get, again, it's similar issues, right? Like it's that separation speed, and with Ostlund, I think also he's going to need to get stronger for sure. He gets pushed off pucks really easily. And I think that's kind of what limited him in my tracked data. Like I'll show you what I'm talking about, because a lot of his track data was not particularly great. I mean, it wasn't terrible. His tracked data was kind of mediocre. There wasn't a whole lot that I'm going, like this is what he does extremely well, right? Like you're seeing a lot of things that rate him in the 30s, 40s, even lower in terms of transition game. But what he does have in spades is he does get involved defensively, similar to Matthew Savoy. And he passes the puck really, really well. It's a little bit safe a lot of the time, but that's kind of what you get him for, right? Like he's a good guy to pass breakouts to, or get pucks to along the perimeter, and he can just make a play from there and connect on those passes and sort of contain possession that way. So I like him, and I think that there's a bit of a longer road than his point production might indicate, but if he works out, he could be better than the 16th best player in this draft. Like, the upside is probably among the highest in the draft if you're patient and he gets stronger. So on that note, at 28, they took Jiri Kulich, who's a guy who I think plays like he's 210 pounds, but isn't quite there yet. He's relatively tall, but really skilled, and has a great finishing ability. He can shoot the puck like very few others in this year's draft, as was on display on the power play at the under 18s and everything. But he's also just a really smart positional player up the middle of the ice too. Just very good back checker, very good forechecker. Just a really well-rounded pro hockey player that I think went undervalued for a long stretch of the year. And to get him at 28, yes, I know everybody who watches this channel was probably screaming Brad Lambert at the TV. But when you've already got Savoy and Ostlund and, like Jiri Kulich could be one of the better third line centers that you could want, right? Like just a guy who you can put out there who can finish on the power play if you want to have him scoring a bit more, especially if he gets a little bit stronger. I could see that role for him. Maybe a second line guy as well. And he just brings a more stable flavor to the center position that I think Savoy and Ostlund, they're a bit more of a question mark. So I kind of like it to cap things off, even though there might have been players that I had ranked higher available in that slot. At 41, Topias Leinonen, look, I don't know. They've got Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, they've got Devin Levi, they've got Eric Portillo, they've got a bunch of goalies, and maybe this is another one that is the guy that actually works out. And it's a good problem to have too many good goaltenders, but I don't know. I was never really blown away with Leinonen when I watched him internationally, and I mean, the Finnish Junior League is kind of messy with quality of opponents. I would have probably swung for someone different here for them, but I mean, I think this is about the only pick where I can really be that critical. And I mean, I'm being very tepid with my criticism. It's not the end of the world. It's just I think there were a lot of players that, especially for Buffalo, I thought would have made a little more sense. But I know Leinonen was pretty coveted by NHL teams, and if they think he's the best goaltender available, they got the best goaltender available right off the bat. On day 2, I should say. 74th, they took Victor Neuchev, who, I mean, I don't know. He shoots the puck a lot, which is how he scores a lot. I don't think I've ever seen as many guys just shoot the puck from the goal line or from the boards as often as Neuchev did. He's got some good edges, but I think he's really wiry and not super quick, not particularly skilled or creative. At 74, again, I watched Victor Neuchev a lot this year. I watched Vladimir Gradinin more. I would have really liked to see Vladimir Gradinin go to the Buffalo Sabres just based on how they were drafting earlier in the draft. But, I mean, they drafted Mats Lindgren at 106, who we'll get to in a sec. Look, if you get a goal scorer to Neuchev, a guy who can finish plays that someone like Noah Ostlund sets up or Matthew Savoy one day, if that's what you think Neuchev can be, then sure, go for it. I know some teams really liked him as high as a late first-round pick. I don't see it that way personally, but you know, he's an interesting swing to make at 74. And then we move to Mats Lindgren at 106, who was probably, I think, one of the last players outside of Vladimir Gradinin who was in my top 40 to go. And I thought Mats Lindgren would slip, but I didn't think he'd slip that far. I mean, he produced quite well. He's very young, almost to 2023 eligible. He's very much like I guess he's like the Antonio Stranges of defensemen in this year's draft. Like, does a lot of weird stuff with his skating for really no particular reason outside of he can do it. A very strange player, and I think a very unrefined one, but a good one, I think, at the end of the day. He's mobile and fluid. I would love to see him more confident offensively and sort of pushing things a little bit more and taking on a bit more, responsibility for his own, to produce on his own and setting up plays in the offensive zone. But as a pretty simple and safe defensive player that can move pucks reliably well, Lindgren is a pretty good choice, and you also have long-term upside based on his age and his skating ability, and you'll see where he is in a little while. At 134, they took Vsevolod Komarov, and this is one of the first players, I think this is the first player, that I had never heard of in this draft series that I had to go back and look at. And there's going to be quite a few of those. So please bear with me. I didn't have time to watch all 225 of these players all the time, all year long. There were a lot of guys that were drafted that I have never heard of before. But so the small samples, I will be very, very clear about who those very, very small samples are about. And I will also be reading my notes based on what I read, what I watched of guys like Komarov. I saw a guy who's kind of rangy. He's really big. He's got decent fluidity on his feet, I thought, from watching him with Quebec. I was a little surprised that he got drafted, but I mean, if he fills out his frame and gets a lot more skilled and creative and deceptive, and I think if you also build on his shot, which I saw was kind of meh, maybe there could be something, but I also feel like he's one of these guys where you could say that about a ton of guys in the NHL draft. His results in terms of impacts on goals, both offensively and defensively, leaned more offensively, so his defensive catalyst percentage was 35%. So when he was on the ice at even strength, his team got scored on at even strength 35% less, and that number was under 2 goals against per 60 minutes at even strength. So that's pretty good. And I felt that he did contribute to that to a certain extent. But yeah, I was a little surprised that he got picked. And Jake Richard, I honestly can't remember now that I'm doing this live on camera. Another really young player like Lindgren. I watched him a bit early in the year and liked him a little bit, and I never really circled back all that much. He's, I think, a little lankier than his elite prospect stats. That's how I've seen it. But I found that he's a guy with soft hands. He receives passes really well, sends passes calmly and effectively really well around the ice. He's got a relatively decent shot as well with some skill that he can use to pull pucks around and change angles and everything. But I didn't really see a high-end, close-quarters skill guy with a ton of pace. Not really that awesome of a hockey player to watch, but he's got moments. And I think, he's one of these guys where you draft him, he's really young, and you just either send him back to the USHL next season or send him to college and just see where he's at in 3 or 4 years. While, obviously you want to be in communication and develop him a little bit, but I'm just saying, you see, he's one of these guys where you see where he is in a few years. Gustav Karlsson was another one who I hadn't seen a ton of up until very recently. I saw bits and pieces of him over the year because I thought, who's this guy scoring a ton of goals in the under 20 league? He seemed to be a guy that I thought came off with really good sort of pre-shot skill and sort of problem solving in those small areas where he can get those goals in a variety of different ways from being in the right position at the right time, doing the right things. Like, he's not a guy where I saw him cutting hockey pucks in half from distance and just ripping pucks top shelf. But he's a well-rounded player that I don't think has anything that really sticks out. But he does anticipate play well. He creates space for himself in a few different ways that I like. With his hockey mind, he scored like he scored, and I feel like over time you get 4 years with European guys. So stash him in Europe and see what happens. And I could see some kind of a thing coming out of this guy based around the way he sees the game and how he generates his scoring. Okay, and then moving on to 202, they drafted a guy who scored a lot of points in junior in Sweden, just like Gustav Karlsson and Joel Radkovic-Bernson. I watched him a lot because he was the most productive player on a not great for Lunda team, but they're a great program. And I wasn't really blown away when I was watching him. I mean, he's pretty big. He's pretty resilient on his feet in terms of fighting off pressure and getting to the net. But there wasn't really a ton that really blew me away. I got some questions about him over the year. It feels like there's some folks out there who, may look at statistics and production and go, why isn't anyone talking about this guy? And I think if you're interested in scouting, Joel Radkovic-Bernson is maybe a guy that you might be interested in watching if you get the chance, because I think he is a good example of how production can be a little bit misleading. I don't mean to say he's a bad player. I think he's resilient enough and strong enough and produced enough to be worthy of considering. And if he turns into one of these sort of possession power wingers that can, fend off pressure and make plays, little easy plays around the ice and get to the net, there's nothing that says that he can't work out in the NHL. But I just feel like he's a good example of how of why high producing players aren't always locked at the top of NHL draft rankings, or I shouldn't say, he wasn't even producing a first round pick, but I don't think he wasn't ranked enough to show up on my ranking list here. So that just goes to show that he might be an interesting case study for that. But it's an interesting pick. We'll see where it goes. I don't have much to say about the 202nd overall pick anyway, but I do have a little bit more to say about 211th overall, where they took Linus Sjödin, who I actually like. I like Linus Sjödin. I haven't seen much of him before the draft, but I watched him now after the draft, and I kind of liked what I saw. He's kind of slight on his feet, but I don't think he's small. His shot's really quick. He can get it off his stick really, really quickly. I think there's some good adaptive thinking and some good moments of skill, especially at the SHL level, which is not easy to do for even an 18-year-old like he did this year. I don't think he's a particularly gifted puck transporter, and I think that's what kind of limited his game a little bit this year. And I think he's a little underdeveloped physically, but I think he's another one of these picks that indicates a clear pivot for Buffalo in a new direction here, and I'm really excited to see where it goes, where they're sort of picking up on skill and upside and potential. And I honestly also, he played a lot with Marco Kasper. Did not look bad playing with Marco Kasper in moments when I saw them playing together. So I like the Sjödin pick. It's interesting, and I'm curious to see where it goes. So for the Buffalo Sabres, they're going to be the first one of the day, and I really, really liked Buffalo's draft. They're getting the 1C. I really, really liked their first round, probably more than anyone else, especially when considering where their picks were. And I don't know, maybe I would have done Leinonen differently. Maybe I would have gone a little differently from Neuchev. I can't really complain all that much about guys like Richard, Carlson, Burnson, and Shodin. I really like the Shodin pick as well. Komarov, if you get a minutes eater guy who can play bottom pair, then fine. I still would have liked Vladimir Gradinin at 134 for Buffalo. But such is life. There might have been other things at play there. But again, past a certain point in this draft, there weren't a ton of guys where I'm going, how is this guy not drafted? How is this guy not drafted? And that includes Mats Lindgren. I wasn't surprised he slipped. I am surprised he slipped that far, but pleasantly surprised to see him also end up in Buffalo. So a lot of high upside swings for Buffalo, which I'm always a fan of, and I think they'll do pretty well looking back on this draft in a few years. So that's going to be it for Buffalo. In the next one, we're going to be looking at Washington. So we'll see you tomorrow, all my wonderful people.